Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. And I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. The energy business is so big, you always find something new. Today, we bring on Blake Scott, and we talk about something that really, we do a lot of work around this, but not in this. And so it was really fascinating discussion to see what Blake Scott and his group has going on there. Be sure to check their website out, which is linked in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com, where you can find out all of Blake's information. Without further ado, here is episode 47 of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Well, Blake, thank you for your time today. How's it going?
It's going great. I appreciate you having me, Ryan. Thanks.
Well, good. No, this is great because one of the things that I've often said is that as oil and gas professionals, not only on this show and my other podcasts that I have, is that, the oil and gas people, they get bad reps sometimes because it doesn't appear that they care about the environment. But your company and what you're doing seems to be geared to help oil and gas people, especially on the drilling side, to be environmentally friendly and doing it in a safe way. Can you kind of walk us through what it is you guys do and why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, we deal with drill cuttings, which are the rock particles and some of the drilling mud that comes up out of the wellbore when you drill a well. And that material, the rock cuttings themselves, as well as the drilling mud, has some associated contamination with it. And we take that material and recycle that into load-bearing structures such as the next drilling pad or lease road for the oil and gas company.
Okay, so let's kind of step back here for a second and say, what kind of volume are we looking at? If you're just talking about just Texas maybe, how much of this drilling mud is being produced and then has to be reused or recycled?
Well, from a perspective overall in the industry, basically the American Petroleum Institute has stated that on average 1.21 barrels of drilling waste are generated per foot drilled. So if you use that number, in 2014, 392 million barrels of drilling waste were generated. Now, that includes both the liquid portion and the solid portion, or the cuttings, and that ratio is about 50-50. That would be enough to fill 25,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Wow, that's a lot.
It really is. It's a great deal. I mean, if you think about it in tons, it's about 100 million tons of drilling waste. Once again, about 50% of that would be solid drilling waste. As a comparison, in 2005, according to the American Coal Ash Association, 71.1 million tons of fly ash was produced in the United States. So, I mean, from the perspective of drilling waste versus coal ash produced, the figures in 2014 exceeded the coal ash figures from 2005. It's really rather remarkable.
Right. And now you mentioned that you can recycle or reuse some of this. What percentage of that can be recycled and reused for future projects?
Well, the 50%, so 50 million tons of that, if you're using those 2014 figures, could be recycled. Now, having said that, not all states allow recycling to occur. Some states do and some states don't. For instance, Texas has a specific recycling rule. And then at the other end of the spectrum, say North Dakota, there's not a recycling rule, even though they have decided to have some pilot projects to look at recycling. So even though 50% of that, or 50 million tons, could be recycled, it's not all not all available to be recycled simply due to regulation.
Gotcha. And so what's some of the schools of thought here that are saying that, okay, in Texas we do want to recycle, in North Dakota we're not really sure. What's kind of the argument for maybe why one state does it and the other one doesn't?
Well, I'll back up just a second there, Ryan, if you don't mind, to lead up to the answer to that, which has to do with the way that the material is regulated to begin with. The material has been considered exempt from hazardous waste rule by the federal government. So that means that the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the material was exempted from hazardous waste rule, but is still considered solid waste. That means that each state has primacy over the regulation of a lot of upstream oil and gas waste. And from that perspective, that means that you have a patchwork of regulation across all 50 states, or at least in the states where you have oil and gas production. So some states are a little bit more progressive in areas than other states are, and probably a great deal of that could be attributed to, some states have had in the past more production than other states. For instance, Texas is going to look at things oftentimes ahead of some other states that might not have had as much production in the recent past.
Let me kind of recycle that there, to use that term, to make sure I understand. So what you're saying here, if I understood you correctly, is that because the federal government classified it a certain way, that then allowed the state to have control over what they wanted to do with it. And then because of that, various states have various drilling programs. Obviously Texas is going on, hot and heavy, and they got the Railroad Commission, all this stuff, whereas a state that may not have as much drilling history, they may not be really sure what they want to do with it. Is that kind of what you were saying there?
That's exactly right. And I can even say that, I can take that even a step further. If you look at the rules on traditional methods of how the waste is handled, not necessarily recycling, but some of the basic methods for the way that it's been handled in the past, such as burial or land spreading, things of that nature. Some states require more testing on the material from the standard that it has to meet for closure than other states do. For instance, in one state, you may be able to just bury cuttings without any testing at all, other than just making sure that any free liquid was taken off of it, versus a neighboring state that might require you to test for all of the metals that are considered in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, such as arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, chromium, as well as hydrocarbons and salts. So it's just across state lines, you have a tremendous amount of variability in even the traditional methods of how the waste is handled, let alone any type of consideration for recycling.
Gotcha. Okay, and one other clarification question, because we have a lot of listeners from a lot of different backgrounds. Okay, so we said drilling. Let's break that down. Is this both oil and gas rigs? Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? Is it all? Just kind of break down so everyone's on the same page on where exactly these drilling programs we're talking about, what kind of drilling is going on.
Sure. First of all, we're talking about both oil and gas drilling, and it can be either just vertical wells, or horizontal wells, both. Usually, the way that a lot of that's classified is not necessarily based upon the type of well it is, oil or gas, but whether or not each section of the well is drilled with a particular type of drilling fluid. So, for instance, you might have a portion that's drilled with a freshwater fluid or drilling mud, and then another section that might be drilled with a saltwater mud, and then another section that might be drilled with a oil-based mud.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, and so one of the things that I think that kind of gets lost in some of the discussion is that when we hear about these numbers from maybe the EPA or wherever, it doesn't matter, newspaper reports, the regulations are too loose on oil and gas companies. It seems like what you're saying here is, at least in this case, and in certain states, that hey, that the states are really being proactive here. They could grant leeway, but once they begin to understand what's going on, and once they understand what they can do, they're taking 50% of this waste, and then they're actually allowing it to be reused in future production, which should help benefit the economy, because I would imagine this would be a cheaper solution than building from scratch. Or is it maybe not as cost effective as I'm thinking?
No, it can be very cost effective, but at the same time, you have to juxtapose that against is it being done right? Because there are things that, say, the EPA defines as sham recycling. And so you need to, when you look at recycling methods, you need to make sure that they're legitimate. And you do that typically through an engineered approach. Oftentimes, the problems that states have in looking at various ways to recycle something is constraints from a budgetary perspective, and being able to look at what's the best technology in order to be able to do that. Thankfully, the EPA and the DOD and the DOE have done some things, such as association of organizations like the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, which looks at various new technology and tries to get it out to the states so that they can determine how best to assess a new technology and whether or not it has viability or not.
Gotcha. And so one other question would be is, you said 50% of it can be reused. What happens to the other 50%?
Well, especially from a liquid perspective, multiple things can occur. If you're talking about an oil-based mud, the liquid portion of that is typically recycled itself for future drilling as drilling mud. The freshwater muds can be reused for what is called spud mud on the next well, which assists in also using it as drilling fluid. And then the saltwater mud, some of the same thing. However, typically that material on the water-based sides, both freshwater and saltwater, is either disposed of downhole or land spread.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've kind of gone all over the place, and I want to kind of focus it in now. Let's just say I'm a driller in the Badlands up in North Dakota, and you said there's some pilot programs coming on, and I said, you know what? I want to go ahead and get out in front of this thing before the government, comes in and does all this stuff. I'm gonna call you guys up at Scott Environmental Services. What would you say? Hey, this is what we'd recommend. I know a ton of variables that could affect all this stuff, but just kind of a general walk through the process. How would you advise a client? How should they think it? Because we have drillers who are listening to this, and they might not be familiar with that these regulations could be coming, or not sure what they want to do. So how would you advise a client on just, again, 30,000-foot view on how to think about this?
Well, the first thing that needs to be done is an assessment of what they are generating. In other words, you don't ever want to try and go do something that you don't know what you're dealing with. And what we found in the past is that each well is different, even if you're drilling in the formation. So trying to assess what you have from the perspective of the contaminants that you have in it, the volumes you're generating, is critical in order to being able to formulate a plan on how to best move forward. Once you do that, then trying to determine what can be done with what you've identified that you have. And once you're able to do that, then you can begin to set a plan forward in either talking to a state that may not have recycling regulations, or if you're in a state that does, then in trying to assess how best you move forward in taking advantage of what recycling rules and companies out there that offer those services.
Okay, good deal.
Okay.
And I want to ask you about this before I let you go. On your website, under your technologies and services, you have a few processes that are there. Can you kind of walk the audience through what you guys have developed at Scott Environmental Services, and just the FURMIS process and then the Duro process?
Yes. First of all, our technology is based upon something called stabilization and solidification. And that technology had been around for a while, but mainly used on federal Superfund sites. What we realized is that you could take that material, meaning drill cuttings, using the SS process, and you could create load-bearing structures out of that material. So we patented that process of being able to do that. And one of the processes that came out of that is called our FURMIS process. That's where we take cuttings that you've generated from several wells, and we take that to a new location and build your next location out of that. So that way your waste is never commingled with anybody's waste, and also we take samples at the end to verify that we've met the criteria that needed to be met for recycling, as well as to make sure that it's not leaching into the environment. Our other process is our Duro process, and that's basically where we're doing the same thing, but we're leaving it on the generating site where the well was drilled that it came from, and we're recycling the material there for things like truck aprons before a tank battery, once again for load-bearing structures. And the same set of criteria are utilized to ensure that we're meeting environmental standards.
Awesome. Well, I've enjoyed this. This has been very helpful for me. It's not an area that I deal with a lot. Obviously, we do some stuff with some upstream companies, but not on this side of things. And the thing about environmental, as you mentioned a minute ago, you said you could have different problems inside the same formation. Environmental in general is such a broad topic that you talk about counties and states and regulatory and the federal government. There's always regulatory stuff that comes in. It can get overwhelming, and
Right.
It's hard to. I think sometimes as part of the the process that we kind of look as environmental as we'll bring them when we need to, but actually environmentalists can actually help us expedite our projects, lower cost. And one of the things I like to think about is permitting. Sometimes that we forget about the environmental permits. So utilizing a company like you guys that has some interesting ways to do this stuff, I think is quite helpful. So thank you for your time today. Is there anything that we like to plug or promote that you'd like to get out there for the audience to find you guys at?
Well, I would encourage you to, first of all, visit our website at scottenergy.com. We are always trying to make sure we're bringing new things to the industry, and also by looking at our website, you're able to follow any types of presentations, because our personnel are always giving presentations to be able to update not only the industry but the public on what is going on regarding drilling waste, so that we can make sure everything is as transparent as it can possibly be for the health of the industry.
Okay, great. And we will link to that in the show notes. It looks like you guys also have a current news feed that kind of pops up on your website as well.
We do. That can provide further information on what we're up to.
Awesome. Well, Blake, thank you so much for coming on. We really enjoyed the discussion today, and hope to have you on again in the future.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Blake for coming on. Again, be sure to check out their website at globalenergymedia.com. You can find out every way you can to connect with Blake and all that we discussed today. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.